Hello everyone, welcome to Behind the Battle channel. Don't forget subscribe, like and share please. In early 1939, after Germany annexed Austria and Czechoslovakia, the major European powers that had won World War I, France and Britain, began to awaken to the full extent of Hitler's ambitions. The French cabinet convened and resolved that from that point forward, they could no longer allow Hitler to continue invading small nations unchecked. Meanwhile, the British Prime Minister made a public declaration on March 17, warning that if Germany invaded any more countries, Britain would intervene using all its available power to defend those nations. This was a clear warning that war would break out if Hitler continued his aggressive expansion. Yet, despite these warnings, Hitler remained undeterred. He continued to develop his plans, beginning with preparations to invade Poland, a country that had previously lost a significant portion of its territory to Germany before World War I. On March 31, 1939, just 1 week after declaring guarantees to protect Belgium, the Netherlands and Switzerland, France and Britain jointly issued another declaration, this time guaranteeing Poland's independence. 2 weeks later, on April 13, they extended similar guarantees to Romania and Greece. Shortly afterward, Italian dictator Mussolini followed Hitler's lead and invaded Albania. Despite the guarantees issued by Britain and France, tensions in Poland continued to escalate. France and Britain tried to persuade the Soviet Union to join them in defending Poland, hoping to present a united front strong enough to deter Hitler. However, Soviet participation was complicated. The Soviets themselves had territorial ambitions toward Poland, hoping to reclaim land in the east that had once belonged to the Russian Empire. As a result, the Polish government refused Soviet assistance, fearing that accepting help would come with the cost of ceding eastern territory. Poland thus firmly rejected any plan to allow Soviet troops onto its soil. Negotiations between France, Britain, and Stalin ultimately failed by mid-1939. The Western powers had little to offer Stalin in return for his cooperation. Hitler, on the other hand, moved quickly and decisively. While Stalin was still in talks with France and Britain, Hitler offered him a generous deal. If the Soviet Union agreed to stay out of the coming war, it would be allowed to seize a large portion of eastern Poland. Stalin accepted. On August 23, 1939, Germany and the Soviet Union signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a non-aggression treaty. Included in the pact was a secret clause that divided Eastern Europe between the two powers. It stated that when war broke out, the Soviets would be allowed to occupy the eastern half of Poland and annex the 3 Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. Poland's fate was not determined by diplomacy or treaties, but by the secret pact between Hitler and Stalin. Hitler planned a two-pronged invasion of Poland, with German troops converging on the capital, Warsaw. However, he needed a pretext to justify the invasion. On the night of August 31, 1939, German commandos dressed in Polish uniforms staged a fake attack on a German radio station near the border. This false flag operation allowed Hitler to claim that Poland had attacked first. The next morning, on September 1, Germany launched its full-scale invasion of Poland. 2 days later, on September 3, Britain and France issued an ultimatum demanding that Germany withdraw its forces. When the deadline passed without compliance, both countries declared war on Germany, marking the beginning of World War II. However, while Britain and France had formally declared war, they took no significant military action. Poland was left to face the German war machine alone. Worse still, on September 17, 1939, in accordance with the secret pact, Soviet forces invaded Poland from the east. By October 6, Polish resistance had collapsed completely. The country was divided in two, Germany and the Soviet Union each taking control of their agreed share. After his victory in Poland, Stalin turned his attention to invading Finland, while Hitler began shifting his forces westward, preparing for a confrontation with France and Britain. In the early stages of the Western Front, the battles were primarily naval engagements between the German and British fleets. Once again, Germany resorted to the same tactics it had used during the First World War, deploying submarines to sink any merchant ships headed to or from Britain. It wasn't until mid-1940 that large-scale ground combat began. This occurred after Hitler's forces launched invasions into Luxembourg and the Ardennes, then moved swiftly into the Netherlands and Belgium, finally reaching France by May 1940. When World War II broke out in September 1939, France, despite having a population only half the size of Germany's, fielded a comparably large army with similarly modern weapons. However, France's defeat was due largely to its outdated military strategy. At the time, French defense relied heavily on the Maginot Line, a vast system of fortifications built after World War I along the German border, named after the French Minister of War, André Maginot, who proposed it. France invested heavily in this line, believing it would hold back any German invasion. But in a clever maneuver, Hitler's generals bypassed the Maginot Line altogether. Instead of attacking the heavily fortified border directly, German troops entered France through Belgium, a neutral country at the time. Because Belgium had not aligned itself with either side, France did not anticipate a German advance from that direction. On May 10, 1940, Germany launched simultaneous invasions of Luxembourg, the Netherlands, and Belgium. Just 3 days later, German troops stormed through Belgium and crossed into French territory, crushing French forces stationed along the Meuse River near the Belgian border. Faced with Germany's fast and furious blitzkrieg tactics, tens of thousands of French troops stationed in the southern regions near the Belgian frontier surrendered and willingly laid down their arms, becoming prisoners of war. However, not all French soldiers surrendered so easily. On May 12, General Charles de Gaulle, recently promoted to command a tank division, led a counterattack against advancing German forces. His aim was to buy time for the French military to prepare a defensive line around Paris. Despite his efforts, de Gaulle's tanks were unable to hold off the German advance for long. By the end of May 1940, most of the French defensive lines in the south had collapsed. Britain, France's key ally, began evacuating its troops, along with around 100,000 French soldiers, by ship back to the UK. As German troops pressed from the north, France faced a new threat in the south. On June 10, 1940, Italy, under Mussolini, a close ally of Hitler, declared war on France and launched an invasion from the southeast. Just 4 days later, on June 14, German forces entered Paris. The French government fled the city and relocated to Bordeaux in the southwest. Following this national humiliation, French Prime Minister Paul Reynaud resigned on June 17. He was replaced by Marshal Philippe Pétain, who immediately sought terms of surrender with Hitler. On June 18, from exile in London, General Charles de Gaulle delivered a powerful address over BBC radio. In it, he condemned Pétain's decision to surrender and called on the French people to rise up, take up arms, and continue resisting German occupation. Pétain's government, now based in Vichy, saw de Gaulle's actions as treason and sentenced him in absentia. Nonetheless, de Gaulle's broadcast sparked the beginning of the French resistance movement. Finally, on June 22, the French government signed an armistice with Germany. Under the agreement, France was divided into 3 zones. 1. The northern half, including Paris, came under direct German control. 2. A small southeastern region fell under Italian occupation. 3. The central and southern part remained under nominal French control, governed by Pétain's Vichy regime. On paper, the Vichy regime under Marshal Philippe Pétain was recognized as an independent French government. But in reality, it was nothing more than a puppet state under complete German control. Hitler imposed harsh conditions, the French navy was ordered to disband, and the army was restricted to no more than 100,000 men. Meanwhile, French soldiers captured in northern France remained prisoners in Germany, with no right to return home. To make matters worse, the entire cost of the German occupation in northern France had to be paid by the French government itself. In short, Hitler wanted to crush France both militarily and morally, forcing the country to suffer humiliation equal to, if not greater than, what Germany had endured under the Treaty of Versailles after World War I. But in truth, Hitler went far beyond Versailles. After the First World War, Germany had at least retained its territorial integrity and avoided foreign military occupation. German soldiers were not held as prisoners of war in foreign lands. In mid-June 1940, German forces captured Paris. The French government, led by Marshal Pétain, surrendered and agreed to become a German satellite state. With France defeated, Hitler turned his sights on Britain. He planned to use northern France as a staging ground for an invasion across the English Channel. But Britain was not like France. As an island nation protected by the sea, it would not be easy to invade. Any German attack would require complete control of the Channel, a massive challenge, especially against Britain's powerful Royal Navy. Germany's own navy had been weakened during the invasion of Norway in April 1940. As a result, Hitler placed his hopes on the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force. In July 1940, Hitler offered public negotiations with Britain. Some British politicians and members of the royal family favoured peace talks, hoping to avoid a prolonged war. But the new Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, who had taken over just 2 months earlier, stood firm. He refused to consider any peace while Hitler ran rampant across Europe. Churchill insisted that as a global power with honour and commitments, Britain would not abandon its allies or allow Hitler to dominate the continent unchecked. With diplomatic efforts rejected, Hitler ordered the launch of Operation Sea Lion, his plan to invade Britain. But first, Germany needed to dominate the skies and seas between France and Britain. That meant defeating the Royal Air Force and gaining air superiority over the English Channel. Unfortunately for Hitler, many of his aircraft had already been damaged or destroyed during the Norway campaign. Still, he pressed forward, hoping the Luftwaffe could crush British resistance. In the early weeks of the campaign, from early to late July 1940, it was Germany, not Britain, that suffered the most. The Luftwaffe lost around 180 aircraft, while the Royal Air Force lost only about 70. By the end of July, it became clear that Germany could neither dominate the air nor safely cross the Channel. Hitler reluctantly abandoned Operation Sea Lion. However, he did not abandon the air war. Beginning on the 7th of September, 1940, Hitler shifted tactics. The Luftwaffe launched a devastating bombing campaign against major British cities, especially London. His goal was no longer military conquest but psychological pressure to inflict massive civilian damage and force Britain to the negotiation table. This campaign, known as the Blitz, lasted until the 21st of May, 1941. Over that time, German bombers dropped more than 100,000 tons of explosives on 16 British cities. London was hit hardest. Around 40,000 civilians were killed, and millions of homes and buildings were destroyed or damaged. However, once again, Hitler's bombing campaign failed to achieve its intended objectives. It neither crippled the British economy nor broke the morale of the British people to the point that they would seek peace with Nazi Germany. On the contrary, the German air raids on London, destroying homes and killing civilians, only intensified the British public's anger toward Hitler. Rather than weakening their resolve, the bombing strengthened national unity and boosted support for the British military's efforts to resist German aggression. Economically, the months-long German bombing campaign, which lasted around 8 months, failed to significantly disrupt British industrial production. In fact, instead of declining, Britain's military-industrial output increased during this period. Moreover, by early 1941, Britain began receiving military aid from the United States. In March of that year, the U.S. Congress passed the Lend-Lease Act, which allowed President Franklin D. Roosevelt to send weapons and equipment to Britain. Unlike World War I, this assistance was offered without any requirement for repayment. American military support played a vital role in strengthening Britain's armed forces and bolstering their ability to continue fighting against Germany. Eventually, Hitler had to face a difficult reality: Britain, as an island nation, could not be conquered. Unable to force the British into a peace settlement or successfully invade, Hitler decided to abandon his plans in Western Europe and turn his attention eastward. His next major operation would be the invasion of the Soviet Union, despite a non-aggression pact signed earlier with Stalin, before the invasion of Poland in 1939. By mid-1941, after failing to subdue Britain or divide control of Europe through diplomacy, Hitler halted military operations in the West and redirected his focus to the East. His new target, the Soviet Union. In fact, before World War II broke out, Hitler and Stalin had agreed to cooperate and secretly divide Eastern Europe between them. This deal was formalized in the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a non-aggression treaty signed in August 1939, just weeks before Hitler invaded Poland. In September 1939, while German forces attacked Poland from the west, Soviet troops invaded from the east. As a result, Poland was partitioned between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. Following this, Hitler continued his campaign across Western Europe, invading Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, Belgium, France, and attempting to conquer Britain. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union expanded its influence eastward, invading Finland and occupying the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, while also seizing part of Romania. During the early years of World War II, Germany and the Soviet Union maintained seemingly friendly relations, cooperating both economically and strategically. But beneath the surface, both Hitler and Stalin deeply mistrusted each other. In reality, both sides were preparing for a future war against one another. This uneasy alliance shocked the world. After all, Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia were ideological enemies. The Nazis viewed Soviet communists as dangerous agents of global Jewish influence. Hitler had even made his intentions clear in Mein Kampf, the book he wrote before coming to power. In it, he declared that Germany must expand eastward into Soviet territory to provide living space for the German people and access to vital natural resources. Once in power, Hitler made no secret of his long-term ambitions. He believed it was only a matter of time before Germany would have to invade and destroy the Soviet Union. At the same time, however, Hitler saw temporary cooperation with the Soviets as a strategic move. If working with Stalin could help Germany in the short term, he was willing to do it, at least for now. By late 1940, Adolf Hitler issued orders for the German military to prepare for an invasion of the Soviet Union. At the same time, however, he also attempted to draw Joseph Stalin into the Axis alliance alongside Italy and Japan, hoping to expand the Axis from 3 to 4 members: Germany, Italy, Japan, and the Soviet Union. Stalin, fully aware of Hitler's long-term ambition to seize Soviet territory, saw potential in aligning with Germany, at least temporarily. He believed that joining the Axis might help delay a direct military confrontation with Germany, giving the Soviet Union more time to strengthen its defenses. In November 1940, Stalin sent his foreign minister to Berlin to negotiate the Soviet Union's entry into the Axis alliance. During the talks, the German foreign minister expressed confidence that the current military situation favored the Axis, predicting eventual victory in World War II. It was only a matter of time. Germany proposed a global division of influence among the 4 powers. Each would retain the territories they currently occupied and be allowed to expand in specific directions. Germany would dominate Central Africa. Italy would expand across North and East Africa. Japan would take control of Southeast Asia. And the Soviet Union would move southward through Central Asia toward the Indian Ocean. However, Stalin did not fully accept Germany's proposal. He demanded clear terms regarding the Soviet sphere of influence in Eastern Europe, particularly in Finland, Bulgaria, and Romania, regions contested between Berlin and Moscow. Stalin submitted a counter-proposal, outlining his own vision for territorial division, but Hitler never responded. As a result, negotiations broke down, and the plan for a 4-power Axis alliance collapsed. Just a few months later, on June 22, 1941, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, a massive invasion of the Soviet Union. It became the largest military operation in the history of warfare. Over 3 million German troops, organized into more than 100 divisions, stormed the Soviet border, supported by over 4,000 tanks, 5,000 aircraft and artillery pieces, and a front stretching nearly 3,000 kilometers. In the first few weeks, the Germans advanced deep into Soviet territory, reaching the gates of Moscow by October. But soon, the brutal Russian winter set in. German troops, poorly equipped and far from their supply lines, were unable to withstand the freezing temperatures. Soviet forces, better adapted and now more organized, launched a counteroffensive and halted the German advance. Operation Barbarossa became Hitler's second major strategic blunder, after the failed invasion of Britain. What was expected to be a quick and decisive victory turned into a prolonged, 4-year war of attrition on the Eastern Front. This failure forced Germany to fight a 2-front war, drastically weakening its position. While the Soviets pushed back from the east, the Western Allies, Britain, the United States, and the Free French forces, began mounting offensives from the west. It's important to remember that while World War II officially began in September 1939 with Germany's invasion of Poland, war had already been raging in Asia. Back in 1937, Japan had launched a full-scale invasion of China. By September 1939, when war erupted in Europe, large swathes of China's western regions had already fallen under Japanese control. The remaining Chinese territory was divided, some under the nationalist government of Chiang Kai-shek, and others held by Mao Zedong's communist forces. In the early years of World War II, Germany, Italy, and the Soviet Union were aggressively expanding their territories across Europe. Meanwhile, in the Asia-Pacific region, Imperial Japan, then part of the Axis alliance with Germany and Italy, sought dominance over its neighboring lands. Ironically, Japan had once been an ally of France, Britain, and the United States during World War I, even fighting against Germany. As a reward for its support, the major powers allowed Japan to exert control over parts of China. But this wasn't enough for Japan. Viewing itself as a rising empire deserving of equal recognition, Japan resented being treated as a secondary power by the Western Allies. This frustration led Japan to switch sides in the Second World War, joining the Axis powers, its former enemies, and opposing its past allies from World War I. In September 1940, following the fall of France to Nazi Germany, a new collaborationist French government was established under Marshal Philippe Pétain, aligning itself with German interests. Taking advantage of France's weakened position, Japan began sending troops into French Indochina. Japan's strategic goal was to sever the supply routes of food, oil, and weapons that passed through the Vietnamese port of Haiphong and through Hanoi into China. These supplies were supporting both Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist forces and Mao Zedong's communist troops in their resistance against Japanese occupation. On September 22, 1940, the Vichy French government permitted Japan to occupy the Tonkin region in northern Vietnam, near the Chinese border. However, Japan was not content with this small concession. From 1941 onward, Japanese forces expanded their occupation throughout the rest of Indochina. In response to this expansion, the United States, backed by Britain, imposed harsh economic sanctions on Japan, demanding a full withdrawal from Indochina. These sanctions dealt a severe blow to Japan's economy, cutting off 90% of its oil imports and eliminating about 75% of its international trade revenue. Faced with this economic crisis, Japan's leadership convened a critical meeting in September 1941, under the supervision of Emperor Hirohito, to debate three possible options. 1. Withdraw from Indochina as demanded by the United States. 2. Negotiate and seek compromise with the Americans. 3. Go to war with the United States. Japan chose to pursue negotiations while simultaneously preparing for war in case diplomacy failed. On October 17, just a month later, a significant leadership change occurred in Japan. General Hideki Tojo, the Minister of War, was appointed Prime Minister. In a government meeting in November, Tojo warned Emperor Hirohito that if Japan did not act now, the country risked falling into Third World status within 2 or 3 years. On November 5, Japan made the fateful decision to go to war with the United States. The deadline was set: if no agreement could be reached with the Americans by November 30, Japan would strike. In parallel, Japan ordered its naval forces to begin preparations for an attack. On November 25, a fleet quietly departed, heading towards its target, America. Meanwhile, the Japanese forces stationed in Indochina were also making preparations. Their objective, to invade southern Thailand and open a path toward the British colony of Malaya and the Dutch East Indies. Unbeknownst to the Japanese, the United States had cracked Japan's diplomatic codes. American intelligence had been intercepting and decoding secret communications between Tokyo, the Japanese military, and diplomats in Washington. Through this, U.S. officials learned that while Japan appeared to be negotiating, it was in fact secretly preparing for war. In the course of these negotiations, the U.S. grew increasingly suspicious. On November 26, 1941, the American Secretary of State issued a firm set of demands. Japan was to withdraw all troops from Indochina and China and abandon its alliance with Germany and Italy under the Tripartite Pact. These demands infuriated the Japanese emperor, who authorized the drafting of a letter to formally break off diplomatic ties. The letter was to be delivered by Japan's ambassador in Washington on the morning of December 7, a prelude to a declaration of war. As Japan prepared its assault, its naval forces quietly mobilized. Though American intelligence had decrypted Japanese messages and understood that war was coming, the exact target remained a mystery. Japan had been extremely careful to conceal the movements and objectives of its fleet, issuing strict orders to maintain complete radio silence. As a result, the Americans knew an attack was imminent, but not where or when it would strike. Then, on the morning of December 7, the answer came. Japan launched a surprise attack on the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. It was a devastating blow, catching America completely off guard. For over 2 years since the outbreak of World War II, the United States had maintained a policy of isolationism. But tensions with Japan, particularly in the Pacific and Southeast Asia, had been steadily pushing America toward war. By mid-1941, when Japan occupied French Indochina, the United States responded with harsh economic sanctions. These included freezing Japanese assets and cutting off vital oil supplies. Japan, heavily dependent on imported resources, saw these measures as a direct threat to its national survival. Despite months of negotiations, no resolution was found. In November 1941, Japanese Prime Minister Hideki Tojo made the fateful decision: Japan would go to war with the United States. On November 25, the Japanese Navy began moving into position, preparing for a massive strike. Though US intelligence had deciphered Japanese codes and knew of Japan's war preparations, it still had no idea where the blow would fall. The Japanese, for their part, maintained absolute secrecy. Their strategy relied on the element of surprise. The chosen target, Pearl Harbor, located over 6,000 kilometers from Japan, but home to America's key Pacific naval base. In Japan's military strategy, crippling the US Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor was crucial. If successful, it would give Japan uncontested control of the Pacific and prevent American interference in its planned invasions of Southeast Asia. Once the attack on Pearl Harbor was underway, Japanese forces across Asia would launch simultaneous offensives. From Indochina, Japanese troops would push through Thailand into British-held Burma and Malaya. At the same time, they would seize the Dutch East Indies, modern-day Indonesia, and launch attacks on the Philippines, then under American control. On Sunday morning, December 7, 1941, Pearl Harbor was quiet. The US was not at war, and most American troops were enjoying their day off. Only a minimal number of personnel were on duty. At 7 a.m., American radar operators in Hawaii spotted a large formation of aircraft approaching at high speed from the sea. They reported the sighting, but their commander dismissed the warning, assuming these were friendly planes scheduled to arrive from the mainland. In reality, all those aircraft were Japanese warplanes, more than 400 in total, divided into 3 attack waves. They launched from 6 aircraft carriers, accompanied by nearly 50 other warships, both large and small. Their destination, a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. The first wave of Japanese bombers began their assault on Pearl Harbor around 7:55 a.m. It was followed quickly by the second and third waves in rapid succession, giving the Americans virtually no time to react. Just 90 minutes later, the operation was over, and the Japanese forces swiftly withdrew, leaving behind massive devastation. The surprise attack inflicted tremendous losses on the United States. In total, 18 American warships were damaged or destroyed, along with nearly 300 aircraft. Numerous military facilities and installations were also severely damaged. But most tragically, the attack resulted in the deaths of nearly 2,500 American servicemen, with over 1,000 more wounded. And yet, despite this overwhelming success in the short term, the attack on Pearl Harbor is now viewed as a major strategic failure for Japan. Why? Because it failed to destroy America's Pacific Fleet completely, as intended. Crucially, the Japanese did not manage to destroy key fuel storage facilities, repair yards, or weapons depots at Pearl Harbor. Even more significant, the US Navy's most powerful warships, its aircraft carriers, were not in port that morning. They had left days earlier on other missions and were thus spared. In the end, the attack on Pearl Harbor did not give Japan the dominance over the Pacific Ocean it had hoped for. Instead, it awakened a sleeping giant. More than 2 years had passed since World War II had broken out. And for more than 2 years, American public opinion remained deeply divided. Some believed the US should intervene to help its allies, while many others insisted on staying neutral and avoiding foreign wars. But after Pearl Harbor, that debate ended. On December 8, just 1 day after the attack, President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed Congress and requested a formal declaration of war against Japan. Congress approved it almost immediately. 3 days later, Germany and Italy, Japan's Axis allies, also declared war on the United States. And with that, America officially entered World War II. At the time of the war, nearly all of Southeast Asia was under Western colonial rule. French Indochina, which included Cambodia, Vietnam, and Laos, was controlled by France. Burma and Malaysia were British colonies. Indonesia was ruled by the Dutch, while the Philippines remained under American administration. Only Thailand remained independent, due to an agreement between France and Britain that left it as a neutral buffer state. Starting in late 1940, after France had surrendered to Nazi Germany, the French government, now led by Marshal Philippe Pétain, fell under the influence of the Nazi regime. As a result, Japan, which was allied with Germany, began sending troops into French Indochina. Although the region was still officially a French colony, the weakened Vichy government had no choice but to allow Japanese forces to establish military bases there. Japan's invasion and occupation of French Indochina served two main strategic objectives. First, to cut off the supply routes of weapons and materials reaching China. Second, to establish military bases as launching points for further invasions into Western colonial territories in Southeast Asia. However, Japan's aggressive actions in Indochina faced a major obstacle: opposition from the United States. After failed negotiations with the US, Japan decided to strike militarily. On December 7, 1941, Japanese forces launched a surprise attack on the US Pacific Fleet stationed at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Japan's primary goal was to secure dominance over the Pacific Ocean and prevent the United States from interfering with its expansion across Asia, particularly Southeast Asia. Following the successful attack on Pearl Harbor, Japan quickly escalated its military campaign. From their bases in Indochina, Japanese forces moved swiftly to invade Thailand. Their aim was to use Thai territory as a base for further westward invasions into Burma and then India, as well as southward into Indonesia and British Malaya. On December 8, 1941, just one day after the Pearl Harbor attack, Japan began its invasion of southern Thailand. Recognizing its military inferiority, the Thai government quickly sought a ceasefire. That same day, Thailand agreed to become a Japanese ally, allowing Japanese forces to use its territory for military operations. On December 10, Japan used its newly secured bases in southern Thailand to launch an attack on British-held Malaya. Simultaneously, Japanese naval forces moved to invade the Philippines. At that time, the British Empire was heavily engaged in the war against Hitler in Europe and had underestimated Japan's military capability. As a result, they deployed only a limited number of troops to defend their Southeast Asian colonies. In the Milan campaign, the British forces were outnumbered by the Japanese 2-1 and were vastly outmatched in firepower. Within less than a week, Japanese forces had decisively defeated the British in northern Malaya. From there, Japan launched new offensives deeper into Southeast Asia, into Indonesia and Burma. By mid-February 1942, all of Malaya had fallen into Japanese hands. The British also lost their most important naval base in Southeast Asia, Singapore. In the months that followed, Burma, another major British colony, also fell. Even India, the crown jewel of the British Empire in Asia, now faced a direct threat from the advancing Japanese army across its shared border with Burma. In the Dutch East Indies, modern-day Indonesia, Dutch colonial forces were overwhelmed and eventually surrendered control to the Japanese in March 1942. Meanwhile, in the Philippines, American forces were forced to retreat, and by May 1942, Japan had seized control of the entire archipelago. By the middle of 1942, nearly all of Southeast Asia, including Cambodia, Vietnam, Laos, Malaya, Indonesia, the Philippines, and Burma, had fallen under Japanese occupation. Thailand, while officially maintaining its independence, had become a client state of Japan. Adding to this were Korea and parts of China, which Japan had already occupied. At its peak, more than half of Asia was under Japanese control. However, Japan's dominance in Asia was short-lived. The US Navy, which had not been fully destroyed at Pearl Harbor, rapidly recovered and began to strike back. The sleeping giant that Japan had awakened now turned its full power toward defeating the Empire of Japan. By 1942, the Axis powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan, had achieved successive military victories, controlling most territories around the world. In Europe, Hitler's forces dominated from France in the west to parts of the Soviet Union in the east, while southern European countries along the Mediterranean and Balkan regions were under Italian control. In Africa, many British colonial territories fell to German and Italian forces. In Asia, Japan had invaded Korea, China, and Southeast Asia, reaching the border of British-controlled India. Japan's aggression in Southeast Asia and the Pacific began with a surprise attack on the American naval base at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. This attack galvanized American public opinion, which had long been divided, into unified support for entering the war. The United States declared war on Japan on December 8, 1941, though its military forces at Pearl Harbor were not fully recovered yet. Consequently, from December 1941 to mid-1942, the U.S. suffered a series of defeats, including the loss of the Philippines and several Pacific islands to Japanese forces. However, the tide began to turn in May 1942 when the U.S. cracked Japanese naval codes, allowing them to anticipate Japanese movements in the Pacific. In May, the US discovered Japan's plan to launch a major attack on Midway Island to eliminate the remaining American aircraft carriers still operational after Pearl Harbor. Unlike the Pearl Harbor attack, the Americans were forewarned and prepared an ambush. On June 4, 1942, American forces decisively defeated the Japanese fleet at the Battle of Midway, marking a critical turning point in the Pacific War. This defeat severely weakened the Japanese Navy, destroying 4 of its large aircraft carriers, over 300 planes, and more than 5,000 personnel. The Japanese Navy's weakened state forced it to halt further Pacific expansion, giving the United States a chance to rebuild and strengthen its forces. From late 1942 through 1943, the US launched a series of successful island campaigns, gradually gaining control over key Pacific territories closer to Japan itself, moving steadily towards the ultimate goal of defeating Japan. In Africa, British forces, with American support and French resistance fighters led by General Charles de Gaulle, began pushing back Italian and German troops. French colonial territories under Vichy control were gradually liberated by the Free French forces. By 1943, the Allied forces controlled all of North Africa and the Mediterranean Sea, opening the way for the invasion and liberation of Europe from Hitler and Mussolini's control. January 1943. In Morocco, a major conference was held involving key Allied leaders: US President Franklin D. Roosevelt, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, French resistance leader General Charles de Gaulle, and General Henri Giraud, commander of Free French forces in North Africa. They met to discuss the next phase of the war against the Axis powers. At this conference, the leaders of the United States, Britain, and Free France agreed not to negotiate or accept any proposals from Hitler or the Axis alliance. They resolved to continue fighting together until the enemy was defeated unconditionally. However, during discussions, Roosevelt and Churchill disagreed on the military strategy in Europe. Roosevelt wanted to attack German forces in northern France, believing it was the best way to liberate Europe. Churchill, on the other hand, argued that German defenses in northern France were too strong and well fortified, making a direct assault difficult. He proposed instead an invasion through southern Europe by attacking Italy, which he considered the weaker point in the Axis defensive line. Ultimately, Roosevelt agreed to suspend plans for a northern invasion of France and instead shifted Allied efforts to invade southern Italy, following Churchill's advice. Meanwhile, Churchill consented to send British troops to assist American forces in fighting Japan in the Asia-Pacific region. Later, in 1943, after successfully pushing German and Italian forces out of much of Europe, the United States, Britain, and their allies began planning the next major operations to liberate Europe and achieve final victory over the Nazis. The Allied forces faced 2 major strategic options for the invasion of Europe. 1. A direct assault via the English Channel into northern France. 2. An attack through the Mediterranean region by invading Axis-held France and Italy. Churchill strongly favored the second option, seeing the Mediterranean as the weak link in Axis defenses. Following extensive deliberations between the United States and Britain, the Allies ultimately chose the Mediterranean route. They decided to launch an invasion of Sicily, an Italian island, deploying large Allied forces already stationed in the Mediterranean. Deception and preparation. Before the invasion, the British organized a secret deception plan to mislead Hitler and the Axis about the true invasion target. In April 1943, British intelligence retrieved the body of a dead Allied soldier, dressed him in a uniform of a British officer, and attached false documents to his body. This ghost soldier's body was then released off the coast of Spain, a neutral country at the time but generally suspected of secretly cooperating with Hitler. The forged documents contained detailed false plans of the Allied invasion, falsely indicating that the main attack would be on the islands of Corsica and Sardinia, west of Italy, far from the actual target of Sicily. Believing these fake documents, Hitler and Mussolini diverted many of their forces to defend Corsica and Sardinia, while only a limited number of German troops remained in Sicily to assist Italian defenders. July 10, 1943. The Allied invasion of Sicily began with an assault force of 150,000 troops, supported by 4,000 aircraft and numerous tanks. By the afternoon of the first day, Allied forces had landed at several points along Sicily's southern coast, including approximately 56 tanks. The invading forces were divided into 5 corps, including 3 American corps, 3 British corps, and 1 Canadian corps, all moving inland from the beaches. The Allies encountered relatively light resistance, as German forces had been redeployed elsewhere following their strategic defeats. This successful operation marked a significant step forward in the liberation of Europe. Just days after the Allied forces began their assault on Sicily, Hitler still refused to redeploy his troops from other locations to reinforce the island. He remained convinced that the secret British documents his forces had intercepted were genuine. As a result, he believed the attack on Sicily was merely a diversion to mislead the Axis powers from the Allies' true target. But Hitler and Mussolini soon realized the truth: Allied troops had swiftly taken control of nearly all of Sicily. The next phase was clear: the entire nation of Italy was now at risk. The fall of Sicily was a devastating blow to Mussolini. He lost support from the Italian people, from King Victor Emmanuel III, and most importantly, from the country's top military leaders. On July 24, 1943, Mussolini was dismissed from his position and arrested. The role of Prime Minister was then handed to a new figure, a senior military officer who had long opposed the alliance with Hitler. No sooner had this new leader taken power than he began secret negotiations with Britain and the United States to end the war. However, German forces were still heavily present throughout Italy, forcing the talks to remain top secret. On September 3, 1943, Italy formally signed an armistice with the Allies, agreeing to withdraw from the Axis alliance and exit the war. But the moment this agreement was made public, German troops, already stationed across Italy, swiftly took control of key strategic positions. Hitler then ordered a special operations unit to rescue Mussolini from captivity. Soon after, Mussolini was installed as the head of a puppet government in northern Italy, created and controlled by Nazi Germany. From that point on, Italy existed in name only. Most of its territory was under direct German control. Meanwhile, the Allies found themselves bogged down in intense fighting against German forces just south of Rome, unable to advance further. Ultimately, it became clear that Churchill's strategy to liberate Europe by moving through Italy had failed. So, in June 1944, the Allies shifted to Plan B, launching a full-scale invasion of northern France via the English Channel. The D-Day invasion, launched on June 6, 1944, along the northern coast of France, would go down in history as the largest amphibious assault ever attempted. It marked the beginning of the final Allied push to defeat Nazi Germany in World War II. By 1944, the war had entered its fifth year. 4 years earlier, in 1940, German forces had occupied northern France and begun building the heavily fortified Atlantic Wall, coastal defenses stretching along the English Channel and the Atlantic Ocean, to repel any future Allied landings. In January 1944, while the Allies were still fighting in Italy, an American general was appointed supreme commander to lead a top-secret operation, the invasion of Normandy, codenamed Operation Overlord. After months of meticulous planning, training, and deception operations to mislead the Germans, the Allies were finally ready. On the evening of June 5, over 150,000 Allied troops, including soldiers from the United States, Britain, and Canada, set sail from England aboard more than 5,000 ships. Their mission: to storm 5 designated beaches along a 60-mile stretch of the French coastline in Normandy. These beaches were given the codenames Sword, Gold, Juno, Utah, and Omaha. At dawn on June 6, as the landing craft approached the shore, Allied battleships and nearly 10,000 aircraft unleashed a massive bombardment on the German fortifications lining the beaches, clearing the way for the infantry to land and secure a foothold. Meanwhile, thousands of Allied paratroopers were dropped behind German lines to destroy heavy artillery and cut off strategic routes to prevent German reinforcements, especially tank divisions, from reaching the beaches. At 5:30 a.m., the Allied ground assault began. British and Canadian forces stormed Sword, Juno, and Gold beaches, while American troops attacked Utah and Omaha beaches. By the end of the day, the Allies had secured control of the coastline. However, this success came at a heavy price. Over 4,000 soldiers lost their lives, nearly half of them at Omaha Beach alone, where approximately 2,000 American soldiers were killed. The success of the Normandy invasion on June 6 opened a critical path for the Allies to bring in more troops and weaponry into France. By the end of June, over 1 million Allied troops, along with more than 20,000 tanks and military vehicles, had been transported into France via Normandy. These forces continued to push the Germans back, gradually liberating northern France by August. At the same time, French resistance forces, working alongside American troops, launched another amphibious assault along the southern coast of France, applying the same successful strategy used in Normandy. By late August, the French 2nd Armored Division, led by General Philippe Leclerc, along with an American infantry division, advanced into Paris and liberated the city from German occupation. The liberation of Paris became a powerful symbol of France's freedom from Nazi control, which had begun back in mid-1940. In the months that followed, after France had been freed, the Allied forces invaded German territory from the west, while the Soviet Red Army advanced from the east. In April 1945, American and Soviet troops met at the Elbe River, about 100 kilometers south of Berlin. From that moment, Germany was effectively split. The eastern region came under Soviet control, while the western region was occupied by American and Allied forces. In Berlin, the German army and government had already endured months of Allied bombing since February. Starting on April 16, the Soviet army launched a relentless assault on Berlin, surrounding the city. On April 30, 1945, as Soviet troops reached the center of Berlin, Adolf Hitler, realizing that defeat was inevitable, committed suicide. Just over a week later, the German government unconditionally surrendered. World War II in Europe had come to an end. In early May 1945, with the fall of Nazi Germany, the war in Europe was officially over. Italy's fascist regime had already collapsed, and its dictator Benito Mussolini was captured and executed by Italian resistance fighters on April 28. Hitler had taken his own life 2 days later. Among the three Axis powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan, only Japan remained in the war. On July 17, 1945, the Potsdam Conference took place near Berlin. The meeting brought together the leaders of the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union. It focused on two major issues: post-war administration of Europe and how to jointly bring the war with Japan to an end. It's important to understand the structure of the Allies during World War II. The Soviet Union was not originally aligned with the United States, Britain, or France. In fact, when the war broke out, Stalin and Hitler had made a secret pact to divide and control Eastern Europe. Stalin had even considered joining the Axis powers alongside Germany, Japan, and Italy. However, when diplomatic efforts failed, Hitler invaded the Soviet Union in 1941. For most of the war, the Soviet Union and Japan maintained a neutral stance toward one another, based on a non-aggression pact signed on April 13, 1941. The two nations promised not to attack each other or support attacks by third parties. Eventually, Stalin secretly agreed with the United States that the Soviet Union would enter the war against Japan in Asia. In exchange, the US and its Western allies would intensify their efforts against Germany from the West, helping to relieve pressure on the Soviets, who were heavily engaged on the Eastern Front. In February 1945, during the Yalta Conference, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin had already agreed with US President Franklin D. Roosevelt that the Soviet Union would join the war against Japan shortly after Germany surrendered. At the Potsdam Conference in July, President Truman urged Stalin to honor this agreement. However, around that same time, Truman received a game-changing message: the United States had successfully tested a powerful new weapon, one unlike anything the world had ever seen. It was the atomic bomb. This new weapon was the result of a top-secret project known as the Manhattan Project, which had begun back in 1940, even before the United States officially entered the war. The first successful atomic bomb test took place on the morning of July 16, 1945, in the New Mexico desert. By that time, Germany had already surrendered, leaving Japan as the last Axis power still fighting. Although American military leaders believed Japan could not hold out much longer against Allied forces, President Truman made the controversial decision to use the atomic bomb. The main reason behind his choice was to bring the war to a swift end without the need to launch a full-scale invasion of Japan, which could have cost up to 1 million American lives. Previous battles, such as those on Iwo Jima and Okinawa, had shown how fiercely Japanese soldiers would fight, even in the face of certain defeat. These battles resulted in extremely high casualties on both sides. American leaders feared that invading Japan's home islands would be even bloodier. Another factor in Truman's decision was political, demonstrating America's overwhelming power could also strengthen its global position in the post-war world. Dropping the atomic bomb, some believed, would send a clear message not just to Japan, but also to the Soviet Union. On August 6, 1945, at exactly 8:15 a.m. local time, a U.S. bomber dropped an atomic bomb, nicknamed Little Boy, over the Japanese city of Hiroshima. 3 days later, on August 9, a second bomb, this one called Fat Man, was dropped on the city of Nagasaki. These two bombings killed an estimated 120,000 people and devastated both cities. On August 15, Emperor Hirohito of Japan announced his country's unconditional surrender. The formal signing of the surrender agreement took place on September 2, 1945, officially bringing an end to World War II. Thank you for watching. Good luck.